Whosoever will be saved, before all things it is necessary that he hold the Catholic faith.
Welcome to Veritas et Fus, or Truth and Incense, a podcast about the one holy Catholic and Apostolic faith, and the liturgy, which is the public expression of that faith, particularly as seen through the Anglican heritage. We are your hosts. I'm Father Gregory Seeley, priest in charge in Roanoke, Virginia, and my co-host is...
I am Dcn Lance Davis. I'm the curate at All Saints Church in Aiken, South Carolina.
Now, as this inaugural podcast kicks off, I want to do something I don't plan on doing a lot in the future. It turns out my co-host is the editor of the very attractive and very useful Anglican Office Book. And Deacon, would you hold up and show off your book for the those watching there? So I want to take this inaugural podcast and do an interview, actually, and go through not the nuts and bolts of how to use the book. You've done several videos on that already, and which we will link to in the podcast notes on how to use it. But I want to go back to the theory, the raison d'etre behind it. What is it used for, and what is the unique ethos of Anglican worship, and how does this book fit into it? Because it would look initially almost like a breviary, like you would see a Catholic priest. Obviously, the offices are those of the Anglican structure. So before we begin, can you give us, Deacon, a 30-second snapshot of who you are, your background, and that kind of stuff, and what brought you to being involved in this?
Yes. Well, I spent the last 20 years as an organist and choir director by trade, working in parishes in Georgia, Oklahoma, and New York City, and came into traditional Anglicanism really about 10 years or so ago, and then within the last 4 years I've been pursuing orders, and discovered the beauty of the Anglican liturgy is really the principal factor that drove me into the practice of it and the embrace of traditional Anglicanism.
Excellent. And how did you end up getting involved with this project?
COVID. I have been an avid liturgical book collector for years. And one of the interesting things is, though I began with traditional Roman Catholic liturgical books, old sets of breviaries, pre-Vatican II things, very quickly I discovered that there was a much richer heritage of liturgical works produced by Anglo-Catholics, certainly starting in the mid-19th century, than I had previously been aware of. The difficulty is the vast majority of those works have long been out of print, really since the 50s or 60s. And through my pursuit of these publications, what I discovered was that certainly from the 19th century, it became increasingly common in Anglo-Catholic circles to augment not only the communion rite of the prayer book, and we're all familiar with the various missals, but also the offices. And there were two notable works in the 20th century produced that took the Book of Common Prayer office structure, centered around daily matins and evensong, to larger offices with the 30-day reading of the Psalter and the consecutive sort of Lectio Continua reading of the Scriptures. And the first of these books was called the English Office Book. It, as far as I can tell, first appeared in the scene in the late 19th century and went through several editions and was ultimately revised in 1955. And it took Matins and Evensong from the 1662 prayer book, restored certain seasonal and festal antiphons on the canticles, some antiphons on the psalms, an expanded sanctoral calendar, and bound those supplementary materials together with all of the daily readings, which in the case of that book was the 1922 English lectionary. And in 1944, a similar work was undertaken by Father Paul Hartzell in the United States. And within about a 6-month time, I actually came across copies of both of these texts. And so the English office, this one that I have here, is from the 1920s. And then from 44, and this one I had rebound, was Father Paul Hartzell's prayer book office, which is the same concept as the English office, but was based on the 1928 American prayer book, and far more extensive. He tended to draw on more serum sources for his antiphons and collects and hymns than did the English office book. The difficulty is finding any of these books now. Well, if you're even fortunate enough to find one, they will run you hundreds of dollars secondhand. And most of the copies are not in the best condition. So using them practically as a daily office book just is not feasible for most people. And so then to answer your question, during COVID, I was essentially furloughed and had no work because all the churches in New York City shut down and organists were seen as non-essential workers. And I was sitting in my parents' backyard in Georgia wondering what in the world to do with all this spare time. And it dawned on me, wouldn't it be great if somebody could take the work of the English office book and the prayer book office and bring something like that back into print for everybody, for layman, for cleric. And so I sat down at the computer, opened up pages on my Mac, and just started with the Psalter, typesetting it, seeing what I could come up with. I had zero experience in any kind of typesetting or digital design and layout. And it really just sort of became an obsession. And over the next 6 months, I compiled the first edition of what I termed the Anglican Office Book.
Wonderful. I'm very glad you had that time off to dive into that project. So what I would like to do now is, again, I want to go to the ethos of this more so than anything practical, although I have a few practical questions later on. And what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to take this Anglican ethos and I want to apply it in kind of an apologetic matter. And that is to say, I am now a Roman Catholic. And I'm going to walk up to you and I'm going to say, I have my rosary, I have my devotions, my litanies, I have my Sacred Heart, Immaculate Heart, the Mass. Why? What does this offer me that the prayers that I have as a Roman Catholic does not offer?
Well, if you would allow me to bring in an old tried Anglican metaphor of the three-legged stool, Martin Thornton, who is an author of some repute for his expertise in what he terms English spirituality, he makes a convincing argument that the spiritual life, well matured, is a balance essentially of three factors. The Mass, the Holy Communion, devotion, and the office. And he relates these three foundational rules of the spiritual life to a Trinitarian ethos. So he sees one's devotion, the rosary, litanies, novenas, these sorts of things, as relating to God the Holy Ghost. There's a more subjective, personal element here of spirituality. We have the Mass, which is, of course, then the focus of God the Son, the sacrifice, and then the communication of His divine life to us, and that being really the pinnacle from which all the rest of our devotional spiritual life flows. But then he sees in the office, which he defines as the regular praying of the Psalter and the Scriptures, according to some set curses. He sees this as sort of the bedrock, as really the source from whence the stability of one's spiritual life comes. And so he relates that to God the Father. And the problem that many Christians have, particularly in the current day, is that we get out of balance. We either see the spiritual life as wholly devotional. I'm at home saying my prayers, reading my Bible as I feel moved. Or we tend to err on the side of the sacramental practice. I might make my confession every 2 weeks, go to Mass daily. But what we don't tend to have is this absolute objective element. And this is what he sees as the office. Now, the difficulty has been in the West that for most of her history, the office has been essentially the purview of the clerics and the monastics. We know that in the first millennium especially, there were essentially two forms of the daily office. What's called the cathedral form, and then what we would now think of as more the monastic form. And the cathedral form was tailored to the parishes and the cathedrals. Essentially, you had a selection of psalmody that were used. You had Bible readings that were tailored to whatever the feast or season may have been. And then you had the monastic set, which focused much more heavily on a regular reading of the Psalter, really as the primary purpose of the office. And for most of Western history, it's been settled on a one-week cycle. All 150 Psalms once per week. And this is certainly an admirable endeavor, and there is much to commend it in the literature and in practical experience. However, it is also the case that, at the very least, since the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, when the office increasingly ceased to be primarily a communal prayer that was sung regularly in the parishes and cathedrals, and as it became sort of the private prayer of the priest or of the monastic, there was increasingly a sense that it was oftentimes a burden. So, for example, in the 16th century, you had Quiñones and his famous revision of the breviary that he produced that read the Psalter not over 1 week, but over 4 weeks. And then as recently as 1911, you had Pope Pius X, who recognized as well that there was a complaint, that there was so much repetition of psalmody to the exclusion of others in the way the Roman office had developed by that point in time, that he actually issued quite a sweeping revision of the Psalter that kept the idea of 150 psalms, but eliminated virtually all repetition and thus severely lessened the daily burden. In the midst of this, as a result of the English Reformation and the compilation of the Book of Common Prayer, the English Church takes on this idea that the office, ideally, like the Mass, should be the purview of every member of the church. That clergy and lay should both be able to, in theory, pray the same office together, whether in the church, which of course is the ideal, a sung office with full ceremonial, or privately at home or with the family. And so, largely following the immense success of Cardinal Quiñones' breviary on the continent, Archbishop Cranmer took the ancient breviary structure and reduced it down to essentially two principal offices, a morning prayer and an evening prayer. And he kept the principle, the cycle of the Psalter, but again, he expanded it from 1 week to 30 days, with a set portion in the morning and a set portion in the evening every day. He also restored to the offices a much fuller scriptural cursus. It is unfortunately the case that the breviary had become increasingly bloated with the legends and hagiographies of the saints and the commentaries of the fathers, that as it was put by both Quiñones and Cranmer, you'd very often start a particular book of the Bible, get maybe a chapter or two into it, and then have to leave it off, start another one because of the other readings. So the Book of Common Prayer offices, I think arguably, have proven themselves to be a genius for providing a rule of life for every person in the church. If for no other reason than the fact that not only have they survived now for 500 years and have expanded all over the world as the English church sent out her missions, but now in the present day, both the Roman and the Orthodox communions have essentially adopted as official liturgies the rites of morning and evening prayer as found in the traditional prayer books. So what it does then is it gives clergy and lay together an office that can be prayed and that can bind the church in her sacrifice of daily praise.
Very good. Actually, one of the things that first interested me in Anglicanism, I gained a real savor for it, was two ideas. And the first is that the first job of the church is to pray. Let's take somebody else. And now I'm going to come to you as an Orthodox. I'm going to come to you with there are psalm readings, there are regular readings, there is the Jesus prayer. What is it about this that you think would, why is it what I, Orthodox, want to pray the Anglican Office Book?
So I think from Orthodoxy, we're coming at it from a perspective that actually would have probably in some ways been more akin to the average person's experience of the office in the Roman Church prior to the Second Vatican Council. Unfortunately, I think most Roman Catholics today have almost no exposure to the office, and I will not suggest the Liturgy of the Hours is part of the problem. So Orthodoxy, having never really revised what they would consider to be their daily office, a liturgy that still spans multiple volumes of books, much like the Western Rite did prior to the 16th century. If you are fortunate enough to be in a parish that offers any form of the daily liturgy, you're probably at most going to get a mildly truncated form of what we would refer to as lauds, historically in the West, the morning praises liturgy, and then some form of evening prayer or compline. The reality is, even in the East, there, of course, is no sense that the clergy themselves are bound to the entire office, because it would just be impossible, not only with the number of psalms and their repetitions throughout the week, but all of the extra material that's bounded together. So the problem, I think, then, is we have to get to the heart of what the office is supposed to be. And I think it is fair to say, East and West, that the regular recitation of the Psalter does in fact constitute the principal backbone of the office, and together with that the Scriptures. Now, the Latin Church has had maybe more of a regular approach to the Psalms in recent times. Orthodoxy, if you're an Orthodox layman, and even if your parish has daily Orthros and Vespers, at most, you probably will not ever be exposed to more than 15% of the Psalter. And so this whole backbone of the common praise of the church, dating back to the Hebrew church, is essentially lost. So what the Book of Common Prayer offices are able to do is say, look, we can maintain the historic tradition of the regular recitation of the Psalms in course, but we can do it in such a way that it's actually manageable. Now, it's not haphazard. We don't skip Psalms like the modern Liturgy of the Hours does. We say every 30 days, if you're faithful to this, you will read through the entire Psalter. So for the Orthodox, this is again a way of reconnecting to their fathers. You think about all the great saints, particularly in the East, that prayed the Psalter daily. So clearly, this is something that is foundational to Eastern spirituality as well. But it is just not possible for most laypersons and clergy that I know to pray the Eastern daily liturgy in its fullest extent. And
that was, my thing was that I spent some time in the Byzantine world and was with a Byzantine monastery, and the whole thing is gargantuan. In fact, most Byzantine priests or whatever don't say the whole thing. It's, it is vast and it can be complex, but you're right. And then finally, if I came to you as a Protestant, Protestantism is somewhat of a large gambit, so let's just say that I'm kind of mainstream. I read my Bible regularly. I have my devotions. So I'm in the Bible already. Why would I want the Anglican structure of the office book other than my own systematic reading of the Bible?
One of the key principles we have to understand in the faith is that our liturgy shapes our believing. The Bible, no matter how high your view of inspiration and of its authority might be, will always be a mediated document. The liturgy has over the course of its centuries of development, provided the context for the Scriptures. So when we see something like the Anglican Office Book, where, let's say, we take the unadulterated book of Psalms, that might be what your average Protestant is familiar with. He reads them, he might consult commentaries, but at best it is essentially a subjective approach to the text. When you then take one of these Psalms, so I'm at random here, Psalm 65, Thou, O God, art praised in Zion, and then we add an antiphon to it. Hear us, O God of our salvation, the hope of all the ends of the earth. Now what have I done? I've taken an excerpt, in this case, from that psalm and provided it as a key interpretive passage for the psalm itself. And this is what the liturgy does throughout the course of the seasons and the saints' days, is it provides interpretive context for the Scriptures. One of the things that really opened my eyes is seeing how the historic liturgies use the passages in Proverbs and the Book of Wisdom, the personification of wisdom, as the voice of Our Lady. Now, this is something that, for good reason, no Protestant would come up with by a plain reading of the Scripture. But the way the Church has read the Scripture is a fuller sense, the sensus plenior idea that there are multiple levels of meaning to any given passage in the Scriptures. So the Office Book sets the Scriptures in course. She applies them to the seasons and then brings out the themes appropriate for the Church's liturgical cycle, but also provides direct commentary with the antiphons, the hymns, and the collects. So it takes Bible reading and objectifies it, puts it more into its proper context of how the Church over her history has read the Scriptures.
So it is, it's the Scriptures, but it's also the centuries of wisdom that are kind of almost seamlessly sewn into the reading of the Psalms and the reading of the various books of the Bible and such.
That's right. And we can't forget that this very same men that provided our Scriptures to us, safeguarded them, copied them, etc., that discerned their inspiration, were worshiping with a liturgy. And in many cases, we know some of the very words that they were worshiping with in that time, and they have come down to us today in our traditional rites. So they're deeply important for understanding how the Scriptures were formed and understood.
Thanks. So I want to go inside a little bit here, and I'm not going to go too much into this again as far as any of the structure is concerned. I want to talk a little bit about some of the content and the why of it. The first of all is, and you already touched on this, is the idea of the antiphons. Where did you find these antiphons, and where did, how did, walk me through the placement of the antiphons and the how and the why of it?
So, generally speaking, my principle was this. If we look at the development of Western liturgy, it is fair to say that certainly over the last 1,000 years, there have been three major strains that have held a large influence on the Western office. The first would be, of course, the Curial Office of Rome, which then came to dominate after the Council of Trent. We also have what were termed as the Gallican rites, the sort of French variations of the office. And then we have what Father Anthony Chadwick terms Northern Catholicism. So those medieval rites, we think of particularly in the English context, the rites of Hereford, Sarum, and York. And these liturgies tended to be really quite florid, very elaborate in their music and in the text. So in the AOB, given that the Book of Common Prayer tradition already has built-in divergences from the standard post-Tridentine Roman tradition. For most people, you think of the Sundays after Trinity as opposed to Sundays after Pentecost, as in the Latin tradition. So what I wanted to do then was take the given of the prayer book's assumption that we are based on traditional English forms and apply those. So the antiphons, by and large, derive from the English forms of the breviary offices prior to the Reformation period. Where there are more modern feasts, for example, the Feast of the Most Precious Blood, some of these feasts they didn't exist in the Sarum rite. And so in those cases, I then tried to take one step down and say, well, what did the closest cousins to the Sarum rite, the continued development, have? So Premonstratensian or Dominican, for example. And of course, I'm fortunate that I actually own full sets of breviaries from the 20th century for many of these variant forms of the Latin liturgy. And so what you'll find, though, is that 85 to 90% of the time, the antiphons and such will match what had been in the traditional pre-1955 Roman breviary, with divergences only as necessary for the sake of the English approach to the liturgical development.
Thank you. My second thing is going to be about the hymns, and I have been a personal confession here. One of my real struggles with the Latin breviary was the hymns. I really had a hard time with them. Some of them I go through, and I really never was able to tackle them. The Latin seemed so much more complex than much of the rest of the scriptures were. I can read St. Matthew's the Gospels, I can read St. Paul, I can read the Old Testament relatively comfortably. I come across these Psalms, and I felt like I was really struggling with this. But you found the hymns. It's actually been kind of a pleasure to read these hymns over and get a sense of what they were saying. Where did you find, and how did the hymns work?
So one of the great tragedies of the 20th century that came out of Vatican II is that when Rome decided they wanted to English their liturgy, for whatever reason, by and large, they completely neglected the fact that over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries especially, essentially the entire Latin liturgical tradition had been Englished by brilliant scholars, most of whom were Anglicans, who not only had strong command of the languages, but a strong sense of taste, which is important. So the hymns in the AOB, there are two main places they come from in terms of their sourcing. So the first would be the majority of the office hymns are derived from what we call the pre-Urbanite Latin hymns. So, Urban the 7th or 8th, who ordered the retranslation, as it were, of the old Christian Latin hymns into a more classical meter and classical vocabulary, and still exist.
By the way.
What? Say it again.
When was that? When did he do that?
1700s, I believe.
Okay.
Late 1600s, maybe somewhere around there. Unfortunately, those hymns in the Latin form are what still exist in the 1962 Latin breviary. Ironically, the Liturgy of the Hours, at least in theory, is allowed to use the older ones. So as the Anglicans were translating these, particularly John Mason Neale, he was certainly the most prolific translator, I think, he favored the pre-Urbanite recension of the hymnody. So that's the first place where the AOB is deriving that from. Second is there was quite a body of hymnody present in the Sarum office that never did exist in the Roman office. And we have to keep in mind that the Roman office was comparatively simple and rather terse. At least when you set it up to something like Sarum or York or even the Dominican form of it. So two places that one will notice a major divergence from the Roman breviary will be the Common of Apostles and Evangelists has a hymn that has a stanza that is variable throughout the year depending on which particular apostle we are talking about. And the second major divergence most people who might know the breviary tradition would see is at Compline. Now, the AOB is simplified compared to the full Sarum office of Compline, but there were a dozen hymns that were variable in Compline in the Sarum rite, and we have 4 of them here that are seasonal or festal variants. So there are some works in here in English that, as far as I can tell, have never really been in any wide circulation since their translation in the 19th century. Father Paul Hartzell, who composed the prayer book office, he really did the bulk of the research, and in most cases I used the translations he had already found, though there were a few things that I substituted for what I thought were translations that either flowed better in the English or were more accurately representative of the Latin original.
I think they're beautiful. I really enjoy reading hymns there and such. So my next question to you is going to be concerning the smaller offices, the little offices, prime, terce, sextonum, and then compline. And one of the first things that stands out is that they don't change. Same thing every day. How was that decision made to choose these psalms for this office, and why don't they change?
So this is actually one case where I took a significant departure from the standard Roman tradition, which would have been repeating Psalm 118 every day. That puts you at about 52 verses of psalmody at each of the little hours, prime through none daily, which is considerable, especially when you consider that the Book of Common Prayer 30-day Psalter structure really only averages between 40 and 50 verses at Matins and Evensong. So you would potentially wind up on many days with the little hours each being bigger than the major hours. So what I did instead was looked at the Benedictine tradition, which wisely Benedict intentionally altered what he knew to be the old Roman cursus of the Psalter, and he replaced the recitation of 118 with the gradual psalms. And in so doing, he created a structure for the little hours that was easily memorizable and really could have each office done in 3 to 5 minutes. So that is where I got the inspiration for this, and I took it one step further. The AOB allows for the option of even putting those psalms on a weekly cycle, so that you can only have one of the 3 provided each day. Now, in the second edition, there is an alternative 2-week Psalter table that will allow you to treat the little hours more like Pope Pius X's version of the breviary. Still shorter, though, no more than on average 15 to 20 verses of solemnity a day, to keep the little hours what they're supposed to be, a brief break in the day that sanctifies that point in time. So the idea is they can be memorized, you can pick them up, very quickly get through them, and as you memorize them, because of their unchanging nature, you internalize them.
That was, I thought, one of the geniuses of that. And again, you're right. With the Roman, the ordinariate and such, I have that breviary as well, and it's Psalm 118. It can be actually a bit, you put some time, serious time into doing that. Well, you're right, St. Benedict. I remember this when I was a Benedictine monk for a time, and during the week, the little offices don't change, and Compline does not change. And in fact, Compline was supposed to be, it was sung in the dark and just memorized.
Right. That's right.
With one candle. So the idea of memorization of this was great. Okay, and my final question for you here is going to be considering the anthems and the office of morning and or matins and evensong ends, and then you have a second. You have these memorials, and you have these anthems. What did you find then, and how did that all work?
So in the classical English prayer books, there's this lovely little rubric after the third collect at evensong that says, "In choirs and places where they sing, here followeth the anthem." And for the better part of at least the last couple hundred years, we have tended, I think, to assume that the anthem means whatever choral piece the choir master has picked out that evening to show the talent of his singers, which of course is not what it is at all. Now, our Roman brethren would be very familiar with the idea of an anthem, though in the modern Roman offices, there really are only 4, what we think of as the 4 Marian anthems, which do exist in the AOB, and you'll find them in the second edition after the Office of Compline. But in many of the medieval rites, you had a much longer series of what were called either memorials or commemorations, or very variously known as anthems, that were for any number of things. It could be seasonally based. It could be a prayer for the intercession of the saints, a prayer for peace of the Holy Cross. And these did exist in the Roman office prior to 1911, after which only 2 were retained. There's one that's used most days of the year for the intercession of the saints, and there's a commemoration that occurs during Eastertide of the Holy Cross. So in the AOB, the anthems that you find there are essentially what was provided in Sarum. There have been a series of them done seasonally or festily, depending on the occasion, after the principal hours of Lauds and Vespers, and then a small one done after Compline, which we have there, the Memorial of Our Lady and the Saints, is given in the AOB. So that's where they come from, and it was a way of taking, again, the English prayer book tradition, but removing that subjectivity and restoring to it what was arguably Cranmer's original inspiration for that rubric in the first place.
Excellent. Thank you. So this last piece isn't a question. I was just going to say, did you want to make any comment regarding your thoughts on decisions made or any of the structure, either the temporal or sanctoral cycle in the book?
So the AOB very intentionally was designed following what we might think of today as the pre-1955 Western calendar. This is significant for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it was done practically because the traditional Anglican jurisdictions, generally speaking, use the missals. And our missals, thankfully, have retained the full Western rite. in terms of the calendar. So that needed to happen, first of all. Second, I think that most of what has transpired in the West post-55 and post-1962 has really been destructive to the foundation of the Western liturgy and really what the liturgy is supposed to be. So I believe that right now, at least in terms of an English work, other than the Anglican Breviary, the AOB is the only work presently that has the full pre-1955 Western calendar, all the octaves, all those sorts of things that go along with it. So if you are in a parish that uses the Anglican or the American missals at the altar, the AOB will match that, but again, in a way that is much more accessible than the full breviary would be.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We could probably talk about this forever. Here. Did you have any final comments you wanted to make on any of your thoughts, the ethos, the inspiration, or any of the you talk about kind of Anglican spirituality and its manifestation in the office? And this is I think an excellent book for. It's relatively user friendly, and it really takes you through the organization and the ability to pray with the church like this, the Psalms and the scripture readings and such. Any final thoughts or any final things that you wanted to say regarding your thought process, your organizational process, or anything that you particularly wanted to capture in the creation of this?
I think what was most important for me is recognizing two ideas that need to be brought together. One was the relative simplicity of the rule of life offered by the Book of Common Prayer and its daily offices. But the other side of that realization is that prayer book, matins, and evensong, as lovely as they are also a product of their time. And while on the one hand, it's positive because it affords us that accessible rule of life, on the other hand, as we have certainly seen, increasingly, I think, in the last 70 years, those offices, as they exist sort of bare bones in the prayer books, can be open to a variety of disparate interpretations. And I think one of the things that is necessary today is to recover a deep sense of authentic Catholicity. Not only have we seen what's happened in the Anglican Communion, the formal Canterbury structure over the last half century, but of course we're seeing the same thing happening in the Roman Communion, certainly since Vatican II. A systematic destruction of the liturgical tradition, and then, not surprisingly, following from that, a destruction of the moral and theological tradition. And so one of the things that the AOB does is it is attempted to take a very good thing from the English Reformation, the structure of morning and evening prayer, but to remove all ambiguity from it and to reset it within the Catholic paradigm. Unless you take the AOB and skip things intentionally, it is very clear what the Catholic faith is. There are no disputes about issues of Eucharistic presence or intercession of Our Lady and the Saints or these sorts of things. And this is necessary. If we're going to re-evangelize the West, we're not going to do it by a continued appeal to subjective post-Protestant forms of religion. And I include the modern Roman Communion in that. We've got to return to an authentic sense of what did the Fathers believe, how did the Fathers pray, what was the inheritance the church gave us, learn from the last 500 years and apply what's good and helpful from the English Reformation. But where it has been taken to extremes that haven't helped, let's correct it. And so I hope that that is something the AOB can contribute to as we move forward and attempt to to find our bearings again in this world.
Perfect. I couldn't have said it better. And with that, we thank you for joining us. There will be more to come. God bless.